Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Dalton, and I direct the Cooperative Defense Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of our project report, Shifting the Burden Responsibly, Oversight and Accountability for U.S. Security Sector Assistance. Today, we are going to be engaging in a two-part event. First, delighted to be welcoming Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, Dr. James Anderson, who I'll introduce in a moment. He will provide a keynote discussion on some of the reforms that the Department of Defense has been undertaking over the last 2 years in the security cooperation enterprise. We will then engage with Dr. Anderson in a bit of question and answer period, and then we'll shift to the second part of our event today, which will be an expert panel discussion with representatives from the Department of State, the Department of Defense, as well as experts from our own CSIS staff. So thank you for joining us today and looking forward to an engaging discussion. It's clear, given the U.S. strategic emphasis on increasing burden shifting to achieve common security objectives with allies and partners, that greater scrutiny of how we are accomplishing our strategic and political aims via our security sector assistance efforts is crucial, both from the executive and legislative branch perspective. In the FY 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress made some historic reforms to the Department of Defense side of the equation, and the department has been busily moving forward with those reforms, with the Department of State in parallel undertaking its own steps forward. But I think, as today's discussion will illuminate, there's still much work to be done. In our report, we attempted to provide an overview and an assessment of what the state of those reforms are along planning, operations, training, policy and doctrine, lines of effort, if you will, and provide some recommendations on the way forward. This, of course, is not the end of the story. Much more work to be done by the collective enterprise, but I know my research team and I were really struck by the level of commitment across the enterprise to accomplish these aims more concretely, more comprehensively, and with greater accountability. So we hope that the discussion here today, the findings and recommendations in our report will help further those ends. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, Dr. James Anderson. Dr. Anderson was actually my first supervisor in the Department of Defense when I worked there many years ago. Prior to his current appointment in the Department of Defense, Dr. Anderson served for 3 years as the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Marine Corps University. His previous positions include Dean of Academics and Deputy Director at the Marine Corps War College, Director of the Program in Advanced Security Studies at the George C. Marshall Center for European Security Studies, and Director of Middle East Policy in the International Security Affairs Office of the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Anderson earned his doctorate in international relations and Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Dr. Anderson, we're so delighted to have you here at CSIS today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking Melissa Dalton for the invitation to speak here today. I've had the pleasure of working with Melissa and very appreciative of her research efforts and her team regarding security cooperation. It is an honor to speak here at CSIS, where many of my current and former colleagues have come from. This report could not be more timely. I've been briefed on the report's main findings, and I appreciate the thorough CSIS review of oversight and accountability in the U.S. security sector assistance. This report reminds me of the important role that our friends in the think tank community play, especially when the department is embracing a new approach to the topic. I've had the pleasure to serve in my current capacity as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities since last fall. Our SPC office casts a wide net to include policy oversight of security cooperation, our national defense strategy, the plans necessary to implement the strategy, as well as nuclear deterrence and missile defense. Security sector assistance is a vast enterprise, and it is one of the U.S. government's most effective tools in shaping U.S. foreign policy outcomes. At DoD, we represent a key component of that effort, what we call security cooperation, the authorities governed by Title X of the U.S. Code, which relate to engaging with allied and partner militaries to affect outcomes related to our mutual security. I want to focus my remarks here today on how we are reforming security cooperation within the department and creating a more holistic, strategic security, three major lines of efforts for DoD as we implement our national defense strategy. The security interests of the United States and allies are best addressed together, cooperatively. The United States has a critical leadership role in encouraging allies to be more militarily capable, interoperable, and lethal. With these principles in mind, I'd like to proceed along the following path. I'd like to talk about where we are coming from and how the FY17 reforms security cooperation and the National Defense Strategy are changing the way we're doing business. I'd also like to talk about some of the gaps in our execution and highlight with some examples some places where we are successfully executing our mission and creating security through cooperation. The United States has realized that the primary security challenge of our generation, great power competition, requires a strong network of allies and partners. At the same time, this administration feels strongly that allies and partners need to contribute their fair share towards common security interests. Security cooperation is one of the best tools for our growing ally and partner capacity to contribute more militarily. With smart, limited investments in our partners, we can amplify military effects to deter aggression. Today, the United States is an exporter of security cooperation. However, as a young republic, or even before we became a republic, we were the recipient of security cooperation. For all the noble ideas the United States was founded upon, ideas could not hope to make up for a shortage of gunpowder. The first thing that might be considered a foreign military sale the United States conducted was an important purchase, gunpowder covertly supplied by our friends, the French. And that arms transfer made a difference. Our first active foreign military sale helped us to win at Saratoga and turn the tide of the Revolutionary War. Clearly, things have changed greatly in the post-Cold War environment. The reality is today that we are confronted by an array of emerging requirements and ever-present risks. Because of this, operating by, with, and through allies is not simply a goal. It is a necessity. It is the only path to sustainable progress in combating terrorism or countering any other international security threat, including the reemergence of great power competition. The release of the National Defense Strategy in 2018 marked a turning point for the whole of DoD. We live in an increasingly complex global security environment, and after many years without an update to our fundamental strategic guidance, the time had come to acknowledge changes in the international security environment and the priorities for the Department of Defense. The NDS emphasizes the need to shift the weight of our security cooperation resources from countering terrorism, which has, of course, been the primary focus of the Department's efforts over nearly the past 2 decades, to a renewed focus on deterring and potentially responding to threats from near-peer competitors. Security cooperation relates to all 3 lines of effort in the National Defense Strategy. 1, building lethality. Security cooperation allows us to improve our effectiveness in coalition efforts, to cover down on gaps in our posture, and to ensure that our partners pack a punch in the first few hours of conflict or days of conflict if it comes to that. 2, strengthening U.S. alliances and partnerships. Security cooperation is the primary tool for ensuring our alliances and partnerships are fruitful, meaningful, and that our relationships are a net security contributor, not a detractor. 3, reforming how the department does business. Security cooperation is evolving with the department to become more strategic, more efficient, and more effective. In FY19, we dedicated the greatest amount of funding nearly 25% of the total funding in the security cooperation account to challenges in the Indo-Pacific area of responsibility, nearly $260 million. This is an increase of nearly 75% over what we notified in the year prior. And this does not include regional initiatives such as the Maritime Security Initiative, which I will say more about in a few minutes. Consistent with the NDS, we also increased EUCOM's allocation by nearly 25% from FY18 to approximately $250 million. While CENTCOM continues to rely on separate authorities, in particular the Counter-ISIS Train and Equip Fund and the Afghan Security Forces Fund, we reduced its FY19 Section 333 allocation by 30% from the FY18 level. AFRICOM, NORTHCOM, and SOUTHCOM, for their part, combined receive about 30% of the total funding. The NDS specifies clear priorities, and our security cooperation resource allocations reflect and will continue to reflect those priorities. All that said, I'd like to note at this point that Title II funding is still providing robust tools for engagement and financing of our partner militaries, even in those regions that are not prioritized in the NDS. With all the changes in the last few years, the question arises, how do we explain security cooperation? How do we define it? I think a good way to look at security cooperation in terms of where we're going is to consider all activities conducted by the Department of Defense aimed at enhancing the capability and willingness of U.S. partners, allies, to operate in coalition with or in lieu of U.S. forces in response to shared security challenges. This formulation is largely consistent with how we think Congress envisions our future role in security sector assistance. DoD has always had a robust role in security sector assistance enterprise, but until FY17 reforms, it was spread across the department. There were many purse holders, many different executors, and dozens of legal authorities scattered in a patchwork-like fashion across the U.S. code that overlapped, sometimes acted independently and weren't looked at holistically. Sometimes security cooperation doesn't get a lot of attention. Luckily, CSIS has some of the finest minds in the security cooperation business at work here, and I'm most grateful for the work of Melissa, Kath, Tommy, and others for their efforts on this topic. Security cooperation is often behind the news we read at night, but rarely the frontline story. Luckily, we're also blessed with another influential group that cares deeply about security cooperation, Congress. In FY17, Congress undertook the largest, most sweeping, and most substantial reforms to security cooperation in our nation's history. The FY17 NDAA consolidated dozens of authorities into a narrow band of activities in Chapter 16. It set up requirements for human rights vetting, institutional capacity building, and assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. With lots of work in the trenches by both DoD and Congress, this all hit at once, and it was welcome. Implementing an ambitious vision remains a challenge, particularly for those activities that were funded out of service accounts or regional initiatives. Many security cooperation activities were not being looked at holistically across the spectrum. Programs were siloed and oversight sometimes limited. The Congress believed that the entire system needed oversight from a single executor with visibility across all the authorities and all the different pots of money. This is how we got to Title 10, Chapter 16, Section 382 in the U.S. Code. The notion that the Secretary's designee, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, my immediate boss, shall have, quote, the responsibility for the oversight of strategic policy guidance and the responsibility of overall resource allocation for security cooperation programs and activities of the Department of Defense, end quote. This is where we're trying to go with security cooperation. A holistic DoD-wide enterprise with visibility across the spectrum of security cooperation activities, administered with policy oversight and aligned tightly to strategy. How we define security cooperation is changing as well. At one point, security cooperation basically meant training and equip programs. We're moving away from that. Security cooperation enterprise now encompasses everything from equipment to training to conventional arms sales to exercises. with both high-end and developing partners. Meanwhile, we are prioritizing interoperability and making arms sales quicker and more efficient. In the last 10 years, the department has reduced the average time to process foreign military sales by 30%. And I know our colleagues at DSCA are working hard to streamline things even more. We're also trying to move off of year-to-year planning. My office has been involved in a push over the last 2 years to align security cooperation planning with planning, programming, budgeting, and execution cycle, as well as the global force management cycle, planning 2 years out from the current fiscal year. Further, we're trying to look at security cooperation programs as more life cycle events, planning 5 years out from conception, evaluating them annually, and ensuring that security cooperation activities are built with specific, achievable, measurable objectives in mind. We're also looking at how to make our investments sustainable and effective. A big part of this revolves around institutional capacity building, using our experience as a department to help partners develop their defense ministry apparatus. We're still working on the best ways to do this, but this is critical to our mission. Merely transferring equipment or providing training is insufficient if the Department of Military lacks the professional and bureaucratic apparatus to effectively absorb and employ their capabilities. One tool that has helped us cover down and provide engagement in this field has been our regional centers. We have 5 of them. The George C. Marshall Center in Germany is just one example. Last week, they held an important and timely conference on Ukrainian defense reform efforts. Engagements such as these are valuable, and they're not very expensive. The regional centers provide an excellent example of how small investments can yield high returns over time. The State Partnership Program has also proved a cost-effective, small footprint tool for supporting security cooperation goals of the Geographic Combatant Commands and our diplomatic community. Over the last 24 years, we have established 73 partnerships with 79 countries across all 6 geographic commands. These partnerships have brought diplomatic and military engagement via the National Guard elements, resulting in individual, professional, and institutional contacts and relationships enhancing influence and trust on a worldwide basis. Despite these successes, challenges remain. If you've ever packed your child a lunch for school, you know one of the biggest challenges in regard to security cooperation, the peanut butter spread. For a long time, the department believed that to compete in the world, we had to compete most everywhere. Today, we realize that with limited resources and specific strategic challenges, that just doesn't work. Being everywhere at once, or nearly everywhere at once, is simply not sustainable and not in line with our national defense strategy. We need to bolster our partners and allies that support our strategic objectives and draw down on partnerships that deliver limited effects. Every security cooperation dollar should be spent strategically. Otherwise, we're not safeguarding the taxpayers' money, and we're missing opportunities to place the resources where they are needed most. Which brings me to assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. Much of this is just getting off the ground, but now as we move forward in planning in FY21, we're seeing an increasing emphasis on how we evaluate potential programs, how we monitor ongoing programs, and how we evaluate the effectiveness of executed programs. What began as a skeleton enterprise has developed into a global forward-deployed effort, executed with a spectrum-wide visibility, with the aim of ensuring that resources are effectively utilized and waste is eliminated. That being said, we readily acknowledge that DoD has a ways to go in fully implementing AM&E reforms. My staff is working with DSCA, the combatant commands, and other security cooperation stakeholders to ensure that the AM&E requirements established by Section 383 and the DoD Instruction 5132-14 are implemented. For assessment and monitoring, we have been working with the ground combatant commanders to develop partnership assessments, which provide a baseline of DoD security cooperation planning as required by law. These are already being used in FY21 planning. Monitoring will be a huge focus of our efforts early in the next fiscal year. And we are working with DSCA to appropriately align funding for this effort. For the AA&E workforce, there's a clear need for dedicated expertise within the ground combatant commanders, geographic combatant commanders, and throughout DoD. My staff spearheaded a security cooperation feature force study to develop manning requirements to implement AM&E and other security cooperation reforms. We are working to finalize this study and execute a contract vehicle to fill in immediate staffing gaps. While our trajectory is clear, we have now only just begun to identify and adapt some of the manpower requirements this level of optimization will require. We are finding some flaws in the process and issuing guidance to fix them. We're socializing these concepts from policy with a very large global workforce. Doing this requires buy-in, and broadly speaking, we think we are getting that. We should also understand that security cooperation has its limits. There are some missions for which security cooperation is an effective tool for achieving outcomes, or is not an effective tool for security achieving outcomes, but in other cases, it certainly is. We saw this, for example, with our support of the Syrian Democratic Forces in their efforts to recapture ISIS-held territory. But in some cases, security cooperation alone may not be enough to solve the larger problem of long-term stabilization. Security cooperation is addressing some of the pivotal challenges identified by the National Defense Strategy. The Maritime Security Initiative, which I alluded to earlier, in South and Southeast Asia has, in the last 3 years, provided approximately $175 million in training, equipment, and related support to improve maritime security domain awareness for Asian partners in their exclusive economic zones and strategic waters. We have and will continue to work with other partners in the region to contribute to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Consider also Niger, one of the poorest countries in Africa, but also a willing partner. In 2014, the United States government recognized the need to work with Niger and other Lake Chad region partners to degrade and ultimately defeat Boko Haram. The United States government decided to provide advisors, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance support, equipment, infantry battalion training to enable these partners to take on the terrorist group. In fact, they sat at the nexus of some really big threats, from the terrorist group to a nascent ISIS West Africa. And out of mutual interest, Niger was positioned to contribute meaningfully to U.S. goals by containing violent extremist organizations. We provided some Cessnas, which are versatile, effective aircraft that could allow them to conduct reconnaissance missions on their periphery. 5 years later, they have become a significant partner, making a major contribution to U.S. interests in the Lake Chad region. By working with, by, and through partners like Niger, it gives us more capacity and capability, more options in how we work towards shared goals than our limited force posture alone could provide. Our strategic mandate is clear. The direction of security cooperation is in the law, and the reform necessary is understood. It is for us, it is a matter of providing the necessary policy oversight to see a smooth transition to a new model of security sector assistance that maximizes enterprise visibility, prioritizes appropriately, and offers transparency and accountability to the taxpayers. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Use the moderator's prerogative to ask you a first question. And also very grateful for the support of Open Society Foundations for our project, as well as our prior year's project on improving oversight and accountability for security sector assistance. Dr. Anderson, you spoke about several concrete steps that DoD is taking to align security cooperation with the priorities of the U.S. defense strategy. Given that security cooperation has political effects in a partner country, what is DoD doing to ensure that security cooperation activities are in alignment with broader foreign policy objectives and tied to political outcomes? And perhaps as a branch of that, is there perhaps a risk of moral hazard if the partner makes choices that don't necessarily comport with U.S. values?
Thank you for that. The alignment is kind of a central theme in everything that we do, as I kind of referenced in my remarks. In terms of the big picture, there's a national security strategy that is signed, of course, by the President of the United States. And then when we crafted the National Defense Strategy, the NDS, we made sure that it was consistent with the broader national security strategy. And then as we go down into specific areas and documents for the department, big items like the nuclear posture review, the missile defense review, and all the security cooperation, we are constantly asking ourselves whether we are in fact in alignment with that higher level guidance. So with respect to security cooperation, we look at those broader foreign policy considerations at the very front end, at the very outset. We ask the geographic combatant commandants, their staffs who are involved in security cooperation, to look up front at those dynamics and to make sure that even before we embark upon detailed security planning, that we're taking into account things like human rights, the rule of law, and that we're operating in fully consistent with the law. So the moral hazard issue that you mentioned, I mean, that's not a new risk. That's always been with us. But I think with the appropriate oversight and the congressional mandates that we follow, we are finally attuned to try to prevent those types of conflict. There's the Leahy vetting, and there are strict requirements for remediation. Those security institutions out there that may have violated something in the past, they have to be validated over time to make sure that that's not going to happen again before we can consider assisting them at some point in the future. So those safeguards are in place, but it always, it comes down to personnel being aware of the requirements and being vigilant. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. I'd like to open it up to audience Q&A. I will call on you if you would please raise your hand, and if you can please stand up, wait for a CSIS staff member to pass you a microphone. Please state your name and affiliation and your question in the form of a question. There was a gentleman in the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mike Jajic. I teach at George Mason University and also lecture to the MODAs on corruption. So my question has to do with accountability in a slightly different sense than it was discussed here in terms of eliminating waste. Yesterday, the U.S. Institute of Peace released a report on preventing extremism in fragile states, and the diagnosis of the problem was that kleptocratic and repressive states drive youth into violent extremism. And one of the solutions was to deal with our own security assistance and provide accountability for that so we don't dig the hole deeper. Paul Biya in Cameroon is an example. So I have two questions. When you talk about assessment, monitoring, evaluation, assessment particularly, does the Department of Defense do a risk assessment of corruption before we engage in a major undertaking in terms of security cooperation? And second, the 2018 NDAA, I think, mandated that there be an anti-corruption strategy for, quote, contingency operations, which were not defined. It was really aimed at Afghanistan, but what was done was a generic strategy. Is the generic anti-corruption strategy being applied anywhere? And is there any intention to apply it in Afghanistan, which was really the purpose?
Great, thank you. And I commend to you the USIP report. We actually cite it in our report as well. It's terrific that so many folks are engaged on these critical issues. Please.
So I haven't had the chance to read that report yet, but it's certainly, when we think about assisting partner countries and partner militaries, we do think in terms of their institutions and how healthy they are, and certainly corruption is one of the variables where we don't want to waste taxpayer money, obviously, and we don't want to fuel any abuses. So this is something that we are certainly mindful of, ensuring that our assistance to defense institutions are appropriate and in alignment and consistent with the law. And we do think this is the right approach. The term nation building really doesn't capture what we're trying to get at. It's more institution building. And in my world, in the Pentagon, it's really defense institution building. So that's absolutely in the forefront of our minds, making sure that our dollars are targeted and well spent.
Great. Right here in the front, Jacob.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, and thanks, Melissa, for a great report. As you may know, the SIGAR report on child sexual abuse in Afghanistan recommended extending Leahy reporting requirements to DoD contractors, and in its response, DoD said it was studying the issue. I was wondering if you could update us on where DoD stands at this time on DoD contractors reporting gross violations of human rights to the department as far as Leahy vetting is concerned. Thank you.
So I can't comment specifically on that particular report because I haven't seen it, but I can certainly reaffirm, as I mentioned in the remarks, the department takes very seriously the human rights reporting requirements and the vetting and all the rest, and takes any allegations of impropriety or violence or abuse extremely seriously. So, but beyond that, I cannot comment on that particular report.
We'll probably have time for one more. The gentleman in the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Veal, I'm retired Foreign Service. I have a question. I'm not sure it's really in the ballpark, but I wanted to try it. This is about the EU and the kind of dysfunctional defense industry problem that Europe has in terms of making their defense dollars go further. You've mentioned several things which touch on that, but I'm wondering whether your office or any other part of the U.S. government is aiming at doing anything to put pressure so that our emphasis on increased defense spending by our NATO allies is money that's going to be wisely spent on a division of labor and other types of things that need to be done in that European market. Is that any kind of thing that your office is grappling with?
So my office does not directly engage in kind of the industrial competition and part of it, but my office, as a functional office, we do have equities in NATO and in particular in burden sharing. So some of my team are absolutely involved in those discussions and in efforts to ensure that we do get fair burden sharing and that our allies and partners, in particular in the European theater, our NATO allies are pulling their fair share. So you may have heard of the 20 and the 2 formula that we use. We want to get our partners, our NATO partners, to spend 2% of their GDP on defense matters, and then 20% of that towards really meaningful capabilities. We're not there yet when we talk about the group of 29, but the good news is there's a positive trajectory. And I think the number of countries that are hitting that 2% now has increased quite a bit, and we expect that to increase even further in the coming next couple of years. This was a tremendous emphasis under then Secretary Mattis, and I can assure you it continues to be a similar effort and priority for Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan. In fact, there's a defense ministerial coming up, I believe in June, and the topic of burden sharing as well as other important topics will no doubt be on the agenda yet again.
Terrific. Well, Dr. Anderson, thanks so much for joining us today, for your time and candor. Please join me in thanking Dr. Anderson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Okay. Appreciate it. Hey, Shabo, take out this way. Yeah, please. Go ahead. We're going to do a quick stage after you. Go ahead.
Hey, how are you doing? Kevin, okay, you stay. Yeah, good to see you. Kevin, thanks.
How are you? Good to see you. Be back in a second. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your patience with our set change. I'm so pleased to be joined by three experts from across the U.S. interagency, as well as here at CSIS, to join us for the next segment of our event today. To unpack some of these issues. I'll start with some introductions, just very briefly. In the middle, we have Kara Abercrombie, who is the Principal Director for Security Cooperation Workforce Development Directorate at the Defense Security Cooperation Agency of DoD. Kara has spent more than a decade of service in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, previously serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, the Principal Director for East Asia Policy, and as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, among several other positions. I'm delighted to have Kara joining us today. To my far right, we have Kevin O'Keefe, who is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the Office of Security Assistance of the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the Department of State. Prior to his current position, he worked as a relationship manager for Battelle Memorial Institute's Office of Homeland Security. Prior to that, Kevin served for 26 years as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, which included his service as the military assistant to the Chief of Staff, U.S. Forces Japan, a China Foreign Area Officer, and head of the International Issues Branch at Headquarters, U.S. Marine Corps. And to my right is Tommy Ross, who is a senior associate here in the International Security Program at CSIS. He is also my co-author on our report that we're launching today. Tommy serves as a senior director for policy at BSA, the Software Alliance. Prior to that position, he was the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Security Cooperation in the Department of Defense. In his previous 12-year career as a congressional staff member, Tommy served as a senior intelligence and defense advisor to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, as a legislative director for Representative David Price, and Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. So just delighted to have all three of you joining us here today. We're going to keep this panel discussion fairly conversational. And I'll start with a question for all of our panelists, perhaps starting with Kevin, and then we can work our way through. Kevin, based on the conversation we had earlier with Assistant Secretary Anderson, the great work that state and DoD have been doing together, what are the top 1 to 3 security sector assistance reforms that you've seen gain the most traction over the last year?
Well, let me start out by thanking you, first of all, Melissa, for having me here and all the great work that you or your team has done over the many, many years here. You know, you mentioned that I'm an acting person, and as I like to tell people, when you're acting, it's just an opportunity to do 2 jobs poorly instead of just one. So, and I also question the title of experts. They made experts here, but use that very, very lightly. The ice is very thin here. Also exciting to be with Tommy and Kara up here. We've crossed paths many, many times on multiple issues and whatnot, and Tommy specifically on this issue here. You know, security sector assistance is something that, quite frankly, I've been thinking about for a long time, not to throw any credit in my direction, but our office back in 2010 produced a document, Security Sector Reform, that was signed out at the Assistant Secretary level by Department of State, the Department of Defense, and USAID. Now, anybody that knows anything about the bureaucratic process in Washington, D.C., to have something signed out at the Assistant Secretary level and whatnot. So, but that was, you know, back then, security sector was not a term of art and whatnot, and SSR wasn't. But how long a way we have come since then. So again, I'm very excited, and I guess a truly bureaucratic way about the progress we've done here. I'm going to take your question in a slightly different way. I think the biggest reform or the biggest thing I've seen here is kind of on that comment is a change in mindset. It really is an expansion, as I mentioned, of understanding of what is the security sector. I mean, we throw a lot of terms around in Washington, D.C., what's security cooperation, security assistance, big S, big A, small s, small a, whatnot. But really, I think that we have kind of coalesced around what is that security sector, the whole spectrum, everything from beat cops to military forces, everything between, and also viewing it as a continuum, as a whole cloth, as opposed to whatnot. So I guess the biggest change that I'm seeing from the State Department's perspective is what I will refer to as a catalytic effect. You know, the Department of Defense has been mandated in law to kind of bring all of that together. You know, the counter-narcotics issues, the counterterrorism and whatnot. We didn't have any really at State Department, any forcing function to do that. But I will tell you that, for example, the now pretty universal, not with every authority, but certainly Section 333, which was the centerpiece of the 2017 NDAA, the requirement for Secretary of State concurrence, as well as some joint planning, I think have opened up a lot of eyes in State Department, particularly maybe some of my colleagues over in the law enforcement, our international narcotics law enforcement, counterterrorism, in that, hey, you know, they knew what they were doing and really had episodic, I think, you know, view or visibility of what Department of Defense. When you started getting these proposals, I think they're going, whoa, 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 whoa. So what we've tried to do there, so what I've tried to do there is, and again, we've tried to use that, again, as a catalytic effect to not only increase the cross the river conversation, but or I will offer more importantly, within my own department, have that intra-departmental conversation across the security sector. Because, you know, again, everyone kind of, you know, their cylinders of excellence, you know, have been working for this for a very, very long time and trying to change. Quite frankly, the bureaucratic muscle memory is a challenge. But so I'll refer to some other things here, maybe some things that we're doing here. The other thing I'll just mention tactically, I guess, is the timeline aperture. One of the challenges we've had heretofore is, it's one of the few times I think State Department has actually been ahead of the Department of Defense is, we have had in the military grant assistance our planning conferences for a very long time, and we've looked 2 or 3 years out. Department of Defense would come to the table, and they're really just looking at the year of execution. With the 5-year plan they're coming out and guidance or whatnot, we're now able, I think, on both sides of the river to have a more fulsome conversation along the timeline in addition to across the security sector. Let me stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Car. I'd like to turn to you next. We are going to talk about the initiative that you are spearheading on workforce development in a little bit. But just broadly, as somebody that has worked these issues not just at DSCA, but also as a regional office in policy, what have you seen as the shift over the last year in terms of implementing some of these reforms, and where are they really gaining some traction?
Sure. So at risk of sounding a little parochial, I'm going to say really one of the first observations I would make is the transformation in the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. I was an outsider working with them for many, many years and have recently joined in November, and I would say this is not your grandfather's DSCA. It's not even your father's DSCA. It is truly a transformed organization that has reorganized itself to take a much more strategic approach to planning for security cooperation programs more holistically, looking at strategy to capabilities. How do we set criteria, milestones for the programs we're trying to, for what we're trying to achieve with a given partner, and then putting together the pieces of the various resources that we can bring to bear, whether it's for military sales or grant assistance coming from the Department of State or DoD. But I've seen, quite literally, an organizational transformation that in all my years of, I've never seen such a transformation in all my years of government service anywhere, cultural shift as well as structural shift. So I think that's a big win in terms of supporting the overall security sector assistance reforms that we're trying to achieve. And again, at risk of sounding a little biased and parochial, I think I've seen pretty significant progress in this workforce development reform effort that you alluded to. The 2017 National Defense Authorization Act directed DSCA to establish a professional certification program for the security cooperation workforce. And we, this year, are really taking it from concept and design to implementation. We've identified what the workforce looks like, 22,000 positions across the department. As one State Department colleague noted, that is like 3 times the size of our foreign service. So it's a pretty large workforce. We've built together a grassroots effort across the enterprise to put together a framework for what that certification will look like. We're developing curriculum. We're going to open a Defense Security Cooperation University this September. So you're really seeing concept that was directed in law, for the fiscal year 2017 coming into implementation this year.
Great, and we're going to dig into some of the priorities for that initiative in a little bit. Thanks so much, Carr. Tommy is someone that is an analyst of these issues from the outside, but also was present at the birth and the conception of these reforms. What are your reflections on the state of the reform effort?
So I think there are 2 answers to the question, or 2 levels that you can answer it at, and this is kind of my attempt to reconcile the inner optimist and inner pessimist in me. But I think the more, step back a moment and sort of think about the intent of the reforms. Security cooperation is the most visible set of activities that the U.S. military is engaged in around the world on a day-to-day basis. It is the face of the U.S. military to the world on a day-to-day basis. More than that, it is the tool that combatant commanders most commonly apply to shape the conditions in their theater to help them carry out the operations that they're charged with, to prevail in any military conflict, et cetera. I think for a long time there's been concern that despite those sort of lofty usages or lofty aspirations around security cooperation, it has been largely managed as a marginal set of activities within the department on an ad hoc basis, without a lot of coordination and without a lot of alignment with broader defense strategy. And so the intent of the reforms was really to inject some strategic rigor and some strategic integration into the security cooperation apparatus, and to build some organizational infrastructure around the management of the security cooperation enterprise. Measured by that intent, I think we have to acknowledge that we haven't done very well. We're not very far along in truly aligning security cooperation activities and expenditures with strategic concepts about how security cooperation can advance broader defense objectives. I think there's a lot of work to be done. At the same time, there are a lot of good things happening, and I completely agree with what Kevin and Cara said, both of them. What Kevin said about the way that processes both within the State Department, also within the Defense Department, and between the two departments have improved in their coordination and have granted visibility to a broader set of across a broader set of activities to a broader set of policymakers has been really important. The organizational reforms at DSCA and the workforce development program underway at DSCA are really important. I would add to that pretty significant changes to the way that combatant commands are being asked to assess, plan, and then monitor and evaluate activities that they carry out within their theaters. Those are the building blocks, I think, of realizing the strategic level changes that the reforms were intended to achieve. And this is where I do the reconciliation. I think, from my perspective, when we were undertaking these reforms, truly, we never expected that these would be changes that would happen overnight. What we are asking for with these reforms, and the same I'm talking about the FY17 reforms to DOD, but the same can be applied to the State Department, where I think they face a lot of the same issues moving up above the political military affairs bureau where Kevin works, and thinking about how what PM does is aligned with what, the INL folks, and then the foreign policy objectives being spelled out by the regional bureaus, and how that is all resourced by the resource managers at state. A lot of the same challenges in aligning activities with strategy. But I think what needs to happen in both places is truly cultural and institutional change that's going to take a generation. And so I'm really happy to see the building blocks in place. At the same time, my one caution is that there is a lack of senior leadership attention in this space, and a lack of, and I mean up to the level of the Office of the Secretary himself. And it's not this secretary. There's long been a lack of senior leadership attention. This is why security cooperation has been treated sort of as a marginal area or a niche mission here. But if we're going to get the generational change that we're looking for, that senior level attention has to come, and there have to be resources beyond just attention that are invested in building the organizational infrastructure that the changes demand. And so I think we're falling a little short there, frankly, and I think that would be my one caution as we think about building on the building blocks that are in place.
Great. Thanks so much to all three of you. I want to go back to Kevin, and Tommy started to allude to this in terms of the imperatives within the Department of State under the broad rubric of security sector assistance, and to draw out just two, recognizing that there may well be several. One, in terms of increasing defense trade or arms sales, and the second in improving return on investment for grant-based security assistance. How is the State Department implementing these policies to ensure that the U.S. government is achieving its overall desired political outcomes? And are there instances when those two imperatives might be contradictory?
Well, let me offer a contextual point up front, because I think you're drawing a distinction between arms defense trade and grant assistance that may or may not be there. And the contextual point, the data point I want to provide you is that in states' military grant assistance, about $6.5 billion of your tax dollars goes into the foreign military sales system. In FY18, fiscal year 18, Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which is implements nearly all of that. That 6.5 went into a total and supported about just over $55 billion in arms transfers. So it does feed into that and whatnot. So a question might be, how are we looking at maybe using the grant assistance differently or whatnot in the overall arms transfer space there? I will tell you that, and I think everyone here has realized it, that support for U.S. defense industry and looking for ensuring we have return on investment of what we're now calling SSA really has always been part of I think, the calculus, the interagency calculus. Although clearly it's been, renewed, re-emphasized imperative, particularly with respect to burden sharing, or put another more colloquially, ensuring that the partner has skin in the game, if you will. But it still remains just one of a host of considerations, of policy considerations, that in fact go into any decision on arms transfers, and or if in fact the country is eligible and we want to provide grant assistance to in fact fund those. It's the things that are always considered. The regional, what's the effect on regional stability? Tech transfer, are we giving away, what's the risk that we assume giving a partner something that, what we put our own forces at risk potentially? Looking at how will this support access and influence with the recipient? Obviously, the recipient's absorptive capacity. Can they actually use it? Can they maintain it? And use monitoring, things like that. Broader effect on the recipient, economically, politically, socially, human rights. All of those get mixed into a calculus. And for every conversation, obviously it's a different recipe on that. And Melissa's heard me use this term before, but what I would offer is that between these and all of these, there is, the term I like to use is dynamic tension. Dynamic tension is not necessarily bad, but it's something that you need to realize that exists there. So if in fact there is dynamic tension, there may be some dynamic tension between the grant assistance piece and the broader arms transfer piece. But you see that throughout the arms transfer, the decision-making process. Everything from, with the new national security strategy, the NDS, you have a dynamic tension between shift to great power competition, which arguably is going to be a generational shift. I grew up in a Marine Corps that was focused on that, then we shifted to counterterrorism and whatnot, et cetera, versus we still have some very real threats today. You can look in Iraq, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, you name it, it's there. So there's that dynamic tension there. Dynamic tension between competing, what I call national security imperatives. And I use this even when I'm briefing the Congress. The clear one is counterterrorism. We need to provide this capability now, but it's in dynamic tension with another national security imperative of human rights, rule of law, democracy, and whatnot. The problem we have is those frequently are on different timelines. The threat's knocking at the door. It may take generations, and in fact, to address those other things there. Partner desires and wants. Obviously, very, very important. They have to sign a letter of offer and acceptance. It's not, so how do you balance that off with capabilities that our Department of Defense has deemed, hey, to be great for this partner, they really need this capability, not only to defend themselves, but in fact to help us with whatever we may need to do. So that's what I deal with all day. That's what we deal with. And I would offer, while, again, there is a renewed emphasis on the defense industry and what, that and burden sharing, I think it fits in. It hasn't overcome, I say, trumped small t. It hasn't trumped these other considerations here. What have we done to try to identify and to mitigate some of those risks? Well, one of them is, again, as I mentioned before, the strategic alignment between the departments. Our Director of Foreign Assistance has hosted for a couple of years now what they call strategic sector reviews. It's an interagency review, kind of at the policy level, objectives and whatnot. One of those is peace and security. So again, it's kind of like, what are the broad objectives? Who's doing what to whom? Trying to align. It's terribly imperfect, but it's a start. Our team and throughout State Department now, we have a pretty good track record of participating in Department of Defense planning, particularly at combatant commands, Defense Security Cooperation Agency, OSD policy, and whatnot, joint staff. So we're actually, I had to market, when I first came to State Department 13 years ago, I had to market to all of my colleagues in the regional bureaus and whatnot. This is why it's important. If you want to influence what Department of Defense actions and how they spend their money, you got to get involved in their planning. And their planning is not necessarily, when we say planning, they say planning is different, but I think we've made some there. We hosted for this first time this year, and this is my Don Quixote quest, really a joint programmatic security sector assistance planning sessions. joint in terms of I had all of my functional colleagues at State Department and on the regional bureaus, and then, of course, aligned across the table as well. I've been trying to do that for several years. We tried to do it with Tommy. He just couldn't get there within his building. Then Congress came in and helped. I think the integrated country strategy remains a good tool to help mitigate those risks and identify those. Finally, partner nation planning, where you can get at some of these return on investment and whatnot. We've started with a couple of key recipients, principally ones there, again, a lot of security sector assistance, having resourcing conferences, helping them create 5-year security assistance plans, security assistance roadmaps, which kind of start getting at that return on a 5-year look, return on investment, and whatnot. And then down at the tactical level, back to the burden sharing, we're looking at something. I think everyone's aware that the administration has requested broadened loan authority through the Foreign Military Financing Authority, again, helping burden sharing. We're looking at what are some creative ways we might be able to use grant assistance with partners, maybe to as an incentive for them to use additional national fundings for a major procurement. So those are the types of things that we're trying to do and whatnot. Still very, very nascent, long way to go. But I think I see a light at the end of the tunnel, although I'm not quite sure it's a freight train or it actually is the end of the tunnel. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. Kara, I want to come back to you on the workforce initiative that you are spearheading. In our report, we, I think, broaden the aperture in terms of when we think about security cooperation, who is actually the face and the executors, the planners that are encompassed within that conception of the workforce, to include not only the planners, the practitioners that I think are included in the current scope for DSCA, but also inclusive of foreign area officers, special operators that might be out and about enabling local partners. So a pretty expansive scope. So I'd be curious, just as a first order question in terms of how you are proceeding with your initiative, who is your quote unquote target population, and then what are the specific priorities to move forward on the workforce reforms?
Sure. So I think that was a fundamental question when Congress mandated, let's work to professionalize the security cooperation workforce. Who is the workforce? So the first thing DSCA did was, frankly, survey the enterprise, and it was a process of self-identification. And the workforce, as I mentioned, we've identified more than 22,000 positions, not people. There's probably many more than that as people cycle in and out of these positions. Includes everyone from the folks working for the military departments here in the continental United States who are building out the acquisition cases for foreign military sales or grant assistance, to managing the financing of that, the logistics of that, to our strategic planners at the geographic combatant commands, the folks in OSD policy or the joint staff who are doing the SC planning, to our security cooperation operators in embassies around the world. I mean, it is and the folks who are doing the HADR and the medical assistance. I mean, it's a very diverse workforce. We did, when we were looking at creating a certification program, we did say it is not really viable to include operators in that. If you're going to try to create career paths and a certification program that positions will require that individuals assuming this position, military or civilian, have achieved certain certification status and training, it's hard to do that for operational units. So the way we sort of squared that circle, and this is part of my sort of longer term goal, is all of those individuals who are part of operational units that are engaging in exercises, training, who are deploying to units such as the training and advisory assistance programs in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're all eligible to take the training that we are offering through this program. And so that's one way of getting at it, and we are offering it proactively. Down the road, I'd like to see DSCA play a larger role in working on with their assigning units to get them before they deploy. That is clearly a challenge. We don't own the workforce. We merely are working to help the workforce. And so I think that's point one. Foreign area officers is a separate unit. It's a group that we do sort of get at as they cycle through Security Cooperation Office deployments or rotations, but is also a community that we are looking to work more closely with down the road. But so writ large, my priorities for this workforce development program are to create something that is institutionalized, is enduring, and is perceived by the entire DoD enterprise as valuable. And that's how we're going to gain the buy-in. And I'd like to see in relatively short order, just a few years down the road, somebody who is newly entering a security cooperation position not realizing that we used to do it any different. And the way I'd like to do that is to move out pretty expeditiously and start implementation. So it will take us several years to develop the curriculum to support a 4-tier certification program. We're looking at some positions might only require basic level certification. Others will go up intermediate, advanced, or expert. We only have so many people who can develop this curriculum, so we're rolling that out slowly. So we are going to roll out basic level training this September. We'll be able to start certifying people at the basic level this September. And we're going to go on a rolling basis, and my vision is that we are going to push for implementation very quickly, but build in maximum flexibility so that we can adjust and improve iteratively as we go on. This helps create a culture, an expectation of security cooperation training. It helps create an ethos of a security cooperation workforce across the enterprise that did not exist before. At a minimum, we want people understanding that they are part of the security cooperation workforce and where they fit in that broader enterprise. Again, the challenge, we don't own it, but if we don't own the workforce, I cannot tell the Army, this is who I would like you to assign to this very important security cooperation position, but I can say, hey Army, we agreed that it requires an advanced level certification, and I see that the person you've designated to go there hasn't achieved that yet, so let me help you get that person trained. And the goal being over time, when they see this individual is providing value add from day one on the job, instead of taking 6 months to 3 years to actually learn their position, which frankly is the case today, there will be a greater demand signal to support the program, and will help us with the assignment of trained and qualified individuals to these very key security cooperation positions across the workforce.
Great. Thanks so much for unpacking that, Cara. And it clearly is going to be a generational effort, in finding those ways to incentivize the different components of.
And I just want to add,
go ahead.
And Tommy, you know better than I, but the legislation was largely modeled on what we've done for our acquisition workforce.
Yes.
The language is it's mirror image in many ways. It took that community about 10 years to get their certification program off the ground. Again, we're looking at launch about 2 years after we started this process.
Yeah. So thanks so much for that. So, I think what's clear from the conversation is, there's a widening scope of what SSA touches on, in different communities, and how you incentivize those players to get on board with these reforms. So Tommy, to turn to you, given the growing reliance clearly from the U.S. government, not only in the Trump administration, but the Obama administration before it, on allies and partners to secure common security objectives, DoD also has at its disposal 2 authorities to enable local security forces that aren't technically considered security cooperation or security sector assistance authorities. They are Section 127 ECHO for counterterrorism and the new Section 1202 for irregular warfare. Again, these authorities are not considered by Congress or DoD as part of the security sector assistance toolkit, although they have security sector assistance effects. You are enabling local partners manipulating the monopoly of the use of force in these countries when you leverage these authorities for operational purposes. So to Tommy, what issues do the use of these authorities potentially introduce for the shifting of security responsibilities to allies and partners?
Sure. I'd probably add a third authority to that category, which is JSETS, the Joint Combined Exchange Training, I think is the acronym. Anyway, so you can sort of work your way through a list of concerns. At the strategic level, there are about 70,000 special operations forces. They're deployed to a few dozen countries around the world, and they're carrying out, this is a force about a little bit bigger than the German military as a whole, and they're carrying out activities for which that are pretty opaque. There's not a lot of public transparency, and so there are a set of questions about whether the public should be comfortable with that lack of transparency around such a large and significant set of activities around the world. But I think when we look at SSA, there are a few more particular concerns. One is that as Melissa said, these activities are segregated from SSA activities. And what that means in practice is that key security cooperation planners at the Pentagon, planners and overseers, I think at the Pentagon, at Combatant Command J5s, within military services, at the State Department, in Congress, are because these programs are both segregated from the SSA set of activities and generally highly classified, they are opaque to this set of planners. These planners and overseers don't have any way of understanding that these activities are happening. And so one challenge with that is that you can have, and I should say, a lot of my concerns are about the use of these authorities directly to engage state security forces. They can also be used for non-state forces, and there are additional questions that could be asked of that set of activities. But when it comes to engaging state security forces, if the 127E authority, for example, is used to provide training and equipment to a unit of the military that is already part of train and equip efforts carried out by the SSA community without any knowledge of the two programs, you can have conflicts in those two programs, or at the very least, you can miss opportunities for synergy. I think that is one problem. I think a second problem that kind of arose in the debate around the ambush in Niger last year, a couple years ago, I'm not great with dates, but is that there is a potential for implementers on the ground to be able to blend authorities in a way that makes keeping track from an oversight perspective or a sort of policy direction perspective really difficult. So if a special operations unit is deployed and given orders that allow them to carry out activities under the Section 333 train and equip authority and under 127E or JSETs, for example, a train and equip mission can very quickly become a train and equip and advise and assist and accompany mission. And the folks in the Pentagon who had to sign off separately through separate channels on those two activities, and the folks in Congress who may not even see the two proposals side by side, may not have any idea that you were going to have a train and equip evolve into train and equip and advise and assist and accompany. So I think that's another real challenge. And then the third thing I would say is that the use of these authorities can, and particularly if there is not this kind of coordination that I'm worried about, can have an impact that undermines our objectives in building the capacity of partner militaries, because the special operations authorities by nature are focused on a targeted set of actors within the broader military institution. Generally, the counterpart special forces or special operations forces of the partner military. But because they are so highly classified, again, because they are segregated from the broader SSA set of activities, those special operations activities are carried out in a way that can sort of, instead of reinforcing linkages between the partner unit and its broader institutional structure, it can actually separate those ties. It can create rivalries within the militaries in a worst case that can have significant impacts for political stability. But I think, in any case, it can undermine what is one of our chief objectives when engaging with a lot of partner militaries, which is to create professional, accountable, transparent, effective security governance structures that are able to enforce policy direction throughout the entire military institution. So I think and this is the reason that Melissa is asking the question here, is because you'll see in our report, this came up as a concern by a number of different participants in our simulation exercise, and I think there are some real questions that need to be answered about how we can coordinate these activities in a way that avoids either shooting ourselves in the foot or at the very least missing opportunities.
Well said. And I think we also talk about in the report that the cylinders of excellence that Kevin referred to earlier, that there are rigorous oversight and accountability mechanisms for these authorities that are conducted by the organizations that run them, that plan and program for them. But what is lacking is that overview function, that oversight function to the policy level and across the different use of a range of authorities in a particular country or regional context. And that's the really critical missing piece. We're going to turn to the audience in just a second, but I wanted to do a final sweep with our panelists. Taking stock of our conversation today, more broadly, your reflections on this conversation. If you had your elevator speech moment with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, what would be your top recommendation for improving accountability for SSA? We'll start with Kevin.
Well, just an editorial comment on what Tom was saying there. I would offer that what you were talking about there is another example of dynamic tension, right? You have dynamic tension between the imperative, the operational imperative to provide a military capability for a specific here and now versus, in most cases, many cases, nearly all cases, policy implications that are longer term. Again, a timeline discontinuity as well, so dynamic tension, something we deal with all the time. Biggest challenge, maintain the momentum. Maintain the bureaucratic momentum, particularly in terms, I would offer everything I've already talked about, though, in terms of the intra and interdepartmental planning. I mean, it's all about what are we talking about before we actually start delivering things, putting things on the ground, putting boots on the ground or whatnot. So improved strategy, resource and planning. We've been doing something in the State Department, certainly in my office. I've got 3 security sector assistance teams, and I have a defense sector plans team that does that, in fact, helps to coordinate, in fact, what I call to inform what is the action verb, to inform what fundamentally remains Department of Defense strategies and plans. Okay, so we're looking at a microcosm or whatnot. One aspirational thing that we worked, Tommy and I tried to get out the door, but was what at the time I was calling joint SSA planning guidance. Joint meeting, state and defense put out one document. Well, I've kind of given up on that. Hey, it's Washington, D.C., everybody, so now my buzzword is parallel. Well, come on, let's call it duck a duck here. Parallel planning guidance, where in fact Department of State puts out theirs, Department of Defense, we cross-reference each other and whatnot, because it's all about resources, who controls them, right? But so that's my aspiration right now, and I think we can get there. We're getting you all, your 5-year plan, and we'll see what we can do there. Just a couple of quick tactical data points. Absolutely, you need to continue to focus on, in terms of recipient accountability, is institutional capacity. I mean, that is, you have the Defense Institution Building Program. I see Dave, Kate hiding in the background there. We have a new program that came out of our office that has been funded now the last 2 years, Global Defense Reform Program, small, about $5 million, but again, something that doesn't take a lot of dollars, in fact, to get at that, but you need to do that as far as trying to build all these other things that we're concerned about. Foot stomp. Continue to mature the A&ME process. I mean, where do we want to, what's the baseline, where we go, and in fact, what is that return on investment? And finally, I can't miss an opportunity, though, to make a comment about the senior branch of the U.S. government, the legislative branch. And, we have to go up and engage 8 committees. 8 committees. 4 state ones, authorized, appropriated, Senate, House, and Defense, on just about everything we do. So the 2017 NDA notwithstanding, I'm not even going to pose a question, but I just throw that out there as far as what impact does that have on security sector assistance, coordination, accountability, and all those things, when in fact the funding comes down and I'm not sure, there's cylinders of excellence, stovepipes, and then we have this. So just an observation, somebody's only been doing this for 13 years. I rest my case.
Great, thanks. Cara, final words.
Parallel processes made me think of toddlers and parallel play, and maybe that's an appropriate metaphor.
There you go.
So look, I'm a good bureaucrat. So for my elevator speech, I'm going to talk about my program, which has, in my opinion, the added benefit of being true. Invest in training our personnel and make sure we're doing that. If we have leadership across state and defense enterprise that understand what the objectives are of our security cooperation programs, that we're trying to align them with national interests, that they understand the importance of building in accountability, A&E processes, and that is happening across the board, not just understanding the importance, but how to, that we inculcate that across the enterprise. I say training is the linchpin of success. It's the linchpin of accountability and institutionalizing all of these reforms. So that's my elevator pitch. Helps my program, but I think it's the right answer.
Perfect. Thanks, Car. Tommy.
Yeah, I agree. I got two. One Kevin already mentioned. So the budget exhibit, the security cooperation budget exhibit, which is an example of success because we've done it 2 years now because it was mandated by the FY17 NDAA. It's a good thing, and I think it still could use some details, but it's a step in the right direction, except that it says that the Department of Defense would like to spend $9 million on assessment, monitoring, and evaluation to assess, monitor, and evaluate a $9 billion set of security cooperation activities. So that, for those of you who are good at math, is 1/1000th of the entire security cooperation budget. That is a far cry from the 3 to 5% that is established as an international best practice, and is no way sufficient to look across the broad scope of activities. And by the way, that $9 billion doesn't include everything that DoD does in the security cooperation space, because we're still getting that budget exhibit right. So we got to put our money where our mouth is. There has to be an investment of resources behind the changes that are being made and being talked about here. I think that's really important. My second one is I would really love to see a proliferation of the word no. I talk about aligning activities with strategy. That is not going to happen until the people who have to sign off at all the different levels in the Pentagon, at the State Department, in Congress, start getting proposals that have questionable strategic value, or that may be impractical, or that don't sufficiently address some of our concerns about absorptive capacity or political stability or corruption. They got to take those and say no. When that happens, and when planners start getting return to sender marked on the proposals that they're working on, then we will start to see a significant shift toward the getting the right answers, getting proposals that are for activities aligned with strategy, thought out on a medium-term, 5-year kind of time frame, and built with a theory of change that makes sense.
Great. Thanks so much to the three of you. I'd like to turn to the audience for any questions. If you can please raise your hand, and if there are multiple questions, I will go ahead and bundle them in interest of time. Please wait for a CSIS staff member to provide you with a microphone. State your name and affiliation and your question actually in the form of a question. Looks like we've got one in the back row. Is there a second one? And the lady up front.
Thank you. I'm Jen Taylor. I'm with the Institute for Defense Analyses. And Tommy, this has a nice flow from the last point you just made. One thing that I've been thinking about lately is the strategic alignment being confused a bit with a different kind of strategic implementation of aligning investments just to major threats, where small investments in some way can be rather strategic investments. And so I just wanted you to weigh in additionally on how we can leverage those smaller investments in a bigger way when it might not add up to a larger investment.
Great. And if you could please bring the microphone to the lady up front. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Veronica Cartier, think tank. My question is of the strategic approach towards Indo-Pacific states. With respect, with China claim as a global sea power and rapidly improve their maritime technology, which is created high tension in Asia and Indo-Pacific region. So my question is, what kind of assurance that American offer for the Indo-Pacific states, our allies, assurance from United States in order our expectation of their cooperations.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. Tommy, do you want to start with the question?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a great point. It's something that I wrestle with in my time at the Pentagon, because my feeling, well, to answer your question, I think that we need to set standards for sort of assessing the program proposals and program planning that I was saying we need to say no more often to. I think we need to set standards that involve sort of the coherence and integrity of the proposal, of the theory of change. You know, we need to look at, is this thing going to work? Is it connected to defense objectives? And is it a good value for the investment? Not whether it says Russia or China or something in it. And I think that there are actually, I mean, you can make a sort of counter argument to investing against the threats or adversaries or priorities that are identified in strategic documents, because in many cases, the challenges that we face in the countries that are most on the minds of policymakers are often challenges that security cooperation by itself really isn't going to make a dent in. And yet there are opportunities around the world. And the Assistant Secretary, I think, mentioned Niger earlier. Niger is a really tough challenge, but it is a place where U.S. investment can make much more of a difference than it can in I won't pick on any other countries, but in some of these big strategic challenges we face, where our security cooperation investments just don't really move the needle. So I think that is absolutely a mindset that we need to maintain, and I think sort of vetting proposals based on whether they're actually good versus whether they mention certain country names is a good place to start.
Great. Kevin, did you want to say?
Sure, I can do it real
specific?
quickly.
Yep.
I think, to take an old military recruiting term, quantity has a quality all its own, but in kind of in reverse, right? Small, to your point, a small amount. I think the point there is, though, we need to open the aperture obviously beyond just security sector assistance. Right, and because many of those things, and that's something I didn't mention, but clearly when there's a military component, but then there's all the other foreign assistance that we provide, or investment, the private sector and whatnot. So I think a key there is to look at, it does a little bit in the security sector, but to look more holistically across that, which is what we try to do. We've talked about trying to look holistically across the security sector. State Department, and I think Department of Defense to an extent that they have to and they need to, try to look at all of that. So absolutely a small amount, trying to do that analysis, trying to make the argument, the bureaucratic narrative, as I call it, the marketing narrative. Washington, it's all about finding resources, right? What's the marketing narrative for precisely that? So yeah, absolutely agree with that. It's a great point.
Great. We probably have time for a couple more questions. There's a gentleman here and the gentleman here in the front with the plaid shirt.
Hi, my name is Mick Kiss. I'm a retired military, former security cooperation officer. I'm also on the board of the Foreign Area Officers Association. So in this hand here, I got the AM&E, our PWS that probably a bunch of you guys wrote regarding the security cooperation, using that 1% of all SSE funding to go. 0.1. Yeah. It's still a lot of money though for us in the industry. It's a $250 million. So that's how many people from industry in the room here?
You don't have to answer that.
Okay.
Please, could you proceed with your question,
anyway,
sir?
So the question is, as we go look through the PWS measurement analysis, so as a former security cooperation guy, the old way was, we were acquisition based. We'd be cost schedule production, cost schedule performance. Did we deliver it? Did we deliver on time, and did it cost what we say it would cost? And we'd all get check marks, and up at the COCOM level where I'd work, we'd put a pin on the map and goes, great, it's there. Whereas my friends in state, and one's over here, Julie, would say, yeah, Mick, that's nice and all, but that thing is gonna probably turn into bauxite in 5 years. No, you're wrong, they're gonna take care of it. And looking back, you were right, much of that stuff would turn back into bauxite. So the question is, what are we gonna measure? What are we going to measure for this new program? Or is it going to be more than just cost schedule performance? Because we're really good at that. But what are the things that we're going to spend a lot of money on measuring? So what are some of the, when you use the Intel form, what are the Christmas tree lights that we're looking for?
Okay, so metrics on AM&E, and then the gentleman down here, please. Oh, actually, it was the gentleman in the plaid shirt. I apologize. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a data scientist at a consulting firm, and I had a quick question on the workforce certification program. How would we measure the growth of competence that arises as a result of the process of training these people and certifying them in a program?
Great, thank you. So that last question was clearly for Cara. Do Kevin or Tommy, you want to tackle the AM&E metrics question?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important one. I think you're exactly right. In the delivery thing, that's easy to do, and we're pretty good at doing that. I know at State, and the key really there, I think, is the front end, right? The assessment, because the things you're getting at in the comments that maybe some of, I had never heard my State colleagues say that, but that you're going to provide it. I mean, that's important up front, right? Sustainability, absorptive capacity, can they maintain it, can they use it, and whatnot. But more broadly, what we're looking at is there's certainly the military capability piece, but we've taken it kind of up the next level, and is what is the anticipated broader policy impacts, front end and back end. I mean, that's particularly with military grant assistance, that can be very challenging for multiple reasons, and I'll give you just a couple of them very quickly. One is when you're starting to look at and evaluating a country's security sector, that's hard to do because a lot of they don't want to share, right? So you have to rely on the intel community and assessments of post and security cooperation. So it's difficult to get that. Second is how can you? It's difficult to discreetly identify this funding source providing this capability when in fact there's multiple. There may be national funds, the Brits may be in there, the French may be in there, Department of Defense may be there if we're talking about Title 22 funding and whatnot, so a lot of challenges. But no, I think we're well beyond, I mean, the delivery is very important because, hey, FMS is too slow, and et cetera, but we're well beyond that in thinking about it, in trying to operationalizing that. We're still, like you said, a lot of work to do.
Great.
But great point.
Thanks so much. Cara, on the workforce?
Okay, so thank you for your question. It's a great question, and the fact of the matter is one of the things I am working on now is building in assessment, monitoring, and evaluation of my own program. So this is a work in progress. But there are a few things I know we can measure right off the bat, which is, again, we have a database of all the positions across the enterprise. I will tell you a good number of them are unfilled. And if we have determined these are important positions, we can track the rate at which we get these positions filled. And so that's putting a focus and a spotlight on security cooperation as a priority amongst the enterprise. So that's one thing that we are able to track and will be tracking, as well as the assignment of trained and certified personnel into those positions in the future. So those are very easy to track. But the qualitative question, to your point, will be one that will have to be sort of a dialogue with the community. Are folks, now that they're certified, performing better on their job right out of the gate? And we also have to engage with the community to ensure that the curriculum we're offering is providing the appropriate training, and that involves working with all the experts across the enterprise, including our interagency partners, to make sure we are staying current with laws, practices, policies, and making sure we're getting that out to the workforce right away.
Right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We do have copies of our report, Shifting the Burden Responsibly, available on the table outside. This is intended to be a companion report to the one that we released last year, which set out a framework for improving oversight and accountability for security sector assistance that is available on the CSIS website. But truly grateful for the engaging conversation and candor from our speakers today. Please join me in thanking them for their time and insights.